Hello, and welcome to All Things Considered, a podcast where we discuss important issues with fascinating guests through the lens of critical thinking. I'm your host, Christopher DiCarlo, and today's guest is Dr. Lloyd Hawkeye Robertson. Lloyd is a registered doctoral psychologist with competencies in counseling psychology, educational psychology, and human resource development. Lloyd is also a mixed race Métis from northern Saskatchewan, and he's published on residential school syndrome, the structure of the Aboriginal self, the application of memes to self-understanding, and the evolution of spirituality and religion. He also treats suicide ideation and attention deficit disorder. But also, Lloyd is the founder of the New Enlightenment Project, a website dedicated to free discussion of subjects through civilized debates. The original Enlightenment included a wide range of values that included science and philosophy and human reason. It also talked about progressivism, the idea that life generally gets better as we learn more and more about the world. And it also deals with a sense of cosmopolitanism, the idea that we are all citizens of the world. And this is a fascinating subject because it focuses our discussion in the direction of what does it mean to be a human? And you're going to be surprised to hear Lloyd's views on this recent development of wokeism that's occurring not only in academic circles, but also in HR and in life in general. I think you'll find what he has to say quite fascinating. So, without further ado, let's get thinking. Lloyd Hawkeye Robertson, how are you doing?
Doing well, Chris. How are you doing?
Not bad. It's hotter than Hades here. It's about 33 degrees, and but it's a dry hell, which is good. How are things out there?
Okay, I've been thinking about our conversation, Chris, and I'm thinking about Steven Pinker, and you knew that. Well, in 2005, and this was 3 years after Pinker did his book on the blank slate. Uh, in that book, he said that there was a new religion, a proto-religion starting that included the notion of the noble savage, the blank slate, and the ghost in the machine. And then 3 years after he published that book, you fell victim to the noble savage myth, and that myth said that people aboriginal to the Americas were given this land by a creator, and you taught that we were all of African descent, and this contradicted what was then called and is still called Aboriginal ways of knowing. Uh, Now, since then, you became known as a teacher and a defender of critical thinking. Is critical thinking always in opposition to religiously held beliefs like this?
Hmm. Often, I imagine there are some that could accommodate, but where I ran into trouble was trying to be fair. So, for people who might not know what Lloyd and I are talking about, back in 2005, I was teaching a course at a Southern Ontario university, and it was critical thinking, 93 students. And I wrote on the board, if evolutionary theory is true, then what we get out of that is that in terms of human origins, look around the room, no matter who you are, no matter how different you look from everyone else, we have to be related. It's in fact impossible for us not to be related. So it follows then that we are all African. And I wrote this on the board. And a student of Aboriginal descent said, yeah, but how do you know that? Which is a good question. And I said, well, based on the science that we have now, it's a critical thinking course. And critical thinking teaches us to use methodologies that provide us with the best information available to us. And the best information available to us says that we are all of African descent. And she said, but my people wouldn't accept that. And I said, I can get that. I get that. I'm familiar with certain Aboriginal mythologies. I get it. And then she said, but who's right? And I think what I said next resonated with her. I said, not your people. We can't both be right. We can't get into a big, warm and fuzzy hug and say, hey, what's your truth? This is my truth. Hey, let's get along with a bunch of different truths. No, science indicates that our ancestry came out of Africa from Australopithecines to Homo sapiens, to eventually Homo sapiens, and moved out of Africa, populated the Middle East, populated Western Europe, Eastern Asia, crossed over the Bering Strait some 17,000 to 25,000 years ago. It was possible because there was an ice age that allowed them to walk across the ice. The last glacial maximum, LGM, means the ice age went away. And that meant North America was now divided by big bodies of water for thousands of years until, Lloyd, you'll know all too well, Europeans visited. My ancestors had developed immunities to certain types of diseases, brought a lot of those diseases here, killed a lot of Aboriginal people, whether they knew it or did it intentionally. There are cases where we think that might have actually been used as the first form of germ warfare. But the fact of the matter is, we're cousins, we're related. And this was the point I was trying to get across, was a level of equality and therefore a level playing field from which we can all communicate. And if you want equality, it's science that's going to get you it, not political ideology, right? Not any other kind of ideology. It's science that will do that. And this didn't resonate well with this particular person or with a couple of fundamentalist Christians. And so I received some notification and basically lost a tenure track job. Because of that, we went to arbitration and won, but so what? It was a small consolation to being hired and being a full professor at a university. And that's unfortunate because I gave everybody the option of my bringing in some scientists, this person bringing in some elders. Let's talk. Let's get the conversation going. That's what critical thinking teaches us, is that it doesn't matter what subject we're talking about. It can be done in a respectful manner in which people don't have to hate each other when the conversation is over. And we've lost that. We've lost that in much of our education systems, much of political discussion as well. And I'm going to put it back to you, Lloyd. What have you had any such similar experiences, or do you remember when this was happening to me at the time?
Well, what happened to you, Chris, had a powerful influence on me because here I come from a somewhat different tradition, and one of the traditions of the teachings of the elders is that we're all related. Uh, the phrase is all my relations, and that stands for something. It's repeated in prayers, and you were giving voice to that belief that we're all related. Yet the teaching that a creator placed one group of people on these continents has the implications that others do not belong. I've got a story to tell you about that.
Sure, go ahead.
A friend of mine and I, this is in the early 1980s, we were dating two sisters from a reserve in southern Saskatchewan. And the conversation got to politics. And one of these women said, after the end of a long conversation on this topic, said, "I wish those white people would just pack up and go back to where they came from." And then she looked at the matey and she said, "And you, matey, you should go halfway back." We took it as humor at the time, and it was funny, and we laughed, but there's a message there, isn't there?
Oh, there sure is. Whatever happened? Did you continue dating these women, or?
In both cases, no, but it took a while.
Right. Now, Lloyd, you and I are both humanists, and we are both children of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment movement was a Western European movement which believed that humans had the capability of rising above their natural conditions, learning more about them, and prospering. Some of the defining qualities of being a child of the Enlightenment is that you favor science, you favor philosophy and reason. You consider yourself a cosmopolitan, meaning I have Italian ancestry, but so what? I mean, I have Canadian ancestry as well. Do I consider myself a Canadian? Do I consider myself an Italian, a Canadian Italian? I consider myself a human first. And so in that respect, an enlightened person from that time period looks at all of humanity as being equal. Nobody has any special status or any special privilege. And then, of course, the fourth quality is that things progress, that things have gotten from worse to better, and that the arc does continue to bend towards betterment, that we do know more about how to treat leukemia now than we did 100 years ago. That's progress. And not the flaky kind of progress that you hear sometimes on the far left. You know, I'm a progressive, not that kind of progress, but real, genuine moving forward because we understand more about ourselves and our environment. How do you see those values, right? The Enlightenment values. How do you see, or how would you want to see those played out in education systems? Let's just start with Canada right now. Are these lacking in some way? Have we lost our way? Or are they European white cis male inventions that colonialists brought upon your ancestors to make you think a certain way? Are you being brainwashed? Are you being harmed in some way by these Enlightenment principles? Are we deluded in thinking there's such a thing as better ways of thinking?
Well, Chris, you've just covered a lot of territory, as I'm sure you realize. And I'm going to back up just a little bit and respond to something you said just a little earlier on. And that had to do with the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is characterized as a European invention. And from a historical point of view, that's accurate, in that the Enlightenment, if it was going to occur, had to occur somewhere, and the conditions happened to be right about 400 years ago for it to occur in Western Europe. Having said that, is that the same thing as saying that is Western culture? In a sense, but I don't interpret it that way. It's not a cultural artifact. It's a technology. It's a way of doing science that our ancestors did science long before the European Enlightenment, but it was not as refined in certain ways, and it was not as valued either because there were pressures keeping people who had a volitional and independent way of keeping people in check. People were kept in straitjackets. Well, maybe that's too strong a word. There were boundaries placed on where we could go, and I think that was an aspect of organized religion that dates at least back as far as the Axial Age. The Axial Age was responding to something. For those who don't know, the Axial Age is generally considered to be around 800 BC to about 200 BC, and that's when the major world religions, such as Confucianism and Buddhism and later on, Judaism to start with, and then Christianity at the end of it. It's when these religions evolved. And I think that there was a reason why they evolved, and a very good reason, and an evolutionary reason. It evolved in that form. And I know, Chris, you've done work previously on what I would call proto-religions in the Neolithic era, and that's true, that's valuable. But these world religions evolved for a reason, and I submit that the reason was because culturally, we human beings had evolved to think of ourselves to be able to objectify ourselves. And to do that, we had to have a self. And of course, that's where my major amount of work has been on how people structure their selves. So we had back in that era, early Greek science, sometimes called philosophy, a form of philosophy, but it was really a matter of careful observation and rules of reason that were being evolved. And it wasn't just in Greece; it was replicated in India and in China. And I submit that the religions were responding to something. So fast forward to the rest of your question, Chris. I'm sorry for the long-winded answer here.
That's all right.
But what then happened is the religions that evolved in the axial age were keeping the self in check, putting boundaries on the self, and saying what we could do, what we could investigate. And the idea was to preserve a collectivity. And that the individualism that was already inherent in the self, the Enlightenment declared it to be a good, and that changed the way we did things, and that meant that things like freedom of speech were something that could be defended as a good thing that needed defense, whereas before it was not. And so, viewing the Enlightenment as a technology, it's something that every religion needs to relate to as they would to any other technology. One of the things that a mentor of mine, who's a Ojibwe, once said back in the 1970s, he said that the truck is a very important part of indigenous cultures. Why did he say that? Because every reserve he went to, and every reserve I've been to, there are all kinds of half-ton trucks. And there's reserve mechanics who know how to fix them. It's a very important part of the culture. But it's a technology that has been adapted. And that's the way the Enlightenment should be viewed. It's a technology that different cultures, all cultures, need to adapt to in some way.
Lloyd, you're a psychologist. How have you brought Enlightenment ideals to work with Aboriginal clients? How do you mesh the two? Native understanding of cause and effect, natural elements versus the Enlightenment scientific version. How do you mesh those two?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's a misunderstanding, I think. And the misunderstanding is I've written about a new religion called Native spirituality, and that's with a big N, big A, or you could say Aboriginal spirituality, and that is a system of belief that is held that if you're indigenous, you need to believe this or something similar, otherwise you're not truly indigenous. And so that becomes and that becomes a kind of religion. I would argue that pre-contact indigenous cultures, at least in North America, because in Mexico conditions were a little bit different, the population, yes, if you wanted to cross a large lake, say Lac La Ronge in northern Saskatchewan, you might put tobacco on the shores of the lake and say a prayer before you cross the lake because it's large enough and a storm could come up. And so you are taking your precautions. Right. Now, is that a religious belief? It depends on how it's held. The Cree from the Precambrian Shield, when the Cree invaded the South, the history books say they entered the plains. Well, actually, they invaded the plains and they conquered and drove the Sioux south.
But hang on. That's not what I learned. I learned all Indians were peaceful and there was no warring. They got along and there were no boundaries. There were no borders. That's what I heard. That's what I was taught.
Okay, and I'm tempted to say, who told you that?
But, why, television, of course.
All peoples, wherever they're from, across the planet, all peoples have had wars, and the research shows that the tribal Neolithic peoples, as a percentage of the population, were quite violent. Mm-hmm. And there's stories to back that up. But one way of looking at it is take a look at the numbers of indigenous people in the Americas that existed in contact. Now, part of the problem that happened, of course, was particularly smallpox that decimated millions of people, but still, even so, the numbers were small. Now, as far as we can tell, there were indigenous people. Well, it depends on, there are several waves, but we can go back 20,000 years. That's well enough time to have populated the whole continent. And when colonizers came, the numbers weren't there. Why? Well, it could be argued because the land was fertile and there were people like the Iroquois people who were practicing farming. The population numbers could have been much bigger. The only answer that I can think of is, well, there were a lot of wars going on, and that kept the population numbers down. Now, saying that kind of contradicts what you were told, wasn't it, Chris?
Do you think children are getting shortchanged on actual history of Aboriginal culture because it has been taken and flavored in a particular way that minimizes the reality? Humans in general, not pointing out Aboriginal culture at all, human culture in general was incredibly violent. It doesn't matter who you are or where you go. Before actual civilizations, even as civilizations were developing, you've read enough Steve Pinker's stuff to know this. When the original civilizations, they were brutal. They were almost entirely run by tyrants or dictators. There were human sacrifices quite often, and there was slavery in almost every one of them. Our past, in terms of human civilization, is not necessarily a pretty one. And that's why, as a person of the Enlightenment, we have gone from worse to better, even though there's some horrible things going on in the world today. I got to go with Pinker on this one. I think overall things are generally better, and we're constantly on an arc trying to make things better. So yeah, when I would get my knowledge of my so-called knowledge, information of Aboriginal culture, it was often flavored, and the volume of violence was reduced quite a bit. There's a lot of respect for the land, respect for the animals. They were the first ecologists, that kind of thing. But evidence shows the first natives that came across the Bering Strait hunted large fauna to extinction. I mean, the giant ground sloth, the cave bear, dead within 1,000 years of humans showing up. You know, as one anthropologist said, I bet they arrived, saw these things and said, holy shit, let's eat, because they were easy to hunt and they were huge meat things. And so we do see a decimation of species. And here's another thing, Lloyd, that I'm very interested in. And I don't know how to reconcile this in a way that isn't going to either anger people or eliminate my possibility of ever having tenure ever. And that is, we know, let's just call them what they were, cavemen and women, pre-agrarian, before agriculture was invented, nomadic tribes, came from Eastern Europe, came from what we now call Russia, came into what now is Alaska, came and all the way down to southern tip of South America. We know that. We know that for sure. But do we have a history anywhere, because of the oral tradition? How many tribes have died that we've just never learned about? We know nothing about them. And the rights of Aboriginals now are really the last ones to come over before the Ice Age, retreated and stopped that from occurring. So when we talk about Aboriginal rights, what does that mean? And how far back should we go in trying to determine what's fair? Some entire tribes would have been, there would have been genocide, right? They would have been totally decimated, and there wouldn't be a single one left. And they're gone forever from the annals of history. So how do we figure all this stuff out? How is it that we can be fair to those who died that we'll never know about?
Well, you make some very good points there. And we know that there are at least three waves that came from Asia. Actually, there were probably more than that. But there were waves of migration from Asia that probably didn't take, that probably were
That's right.
defeated. The Inuit they were very recent.
That's right.
And so they're not in the old terminology that's not current now, but it's still useful. The word Indian. Uh, Inuit were not accepted as Indian, but they are accepted as Aboriginal. Why? Well, it's somewhat arbitrary. Basically, anybody who lived here before Columbus had to be Aboriginal. Now, in making that distinction, you get into kind of fuzzy thinking, such as the student that you had at Wilfrid Laurier that said that Aboriginal people believe the Creator placed Aboriginal people on this continent. It was thinking like that didn't make the distinction that you, in fact, are making now. By the way, I have another little anecdote to tell you. This is
Okay.
at a conference where I was actually presenting. It was the Native Mental Health Association of Canada. We're having a conference. This is in around, I think it was 2006, 2007, somewhere in there. And the discussion had gotten onto the Bering Strait theory. Now, this is a use of the term theory that is common among people who are not scientists, quite frankly. The fundamentalist Christians use this as well. Theory is something that's not proved, so it's equivalent of a guess. That, of course, is not a scientific theory. However, that is used to allow room for religiously held beliefs, and so at this conference we were meeting, and the discussion was about the Bering Strait theory and how it may be flawed. And there were a bunch of Métis in the room. And near the end of the discussion, I stood up and I said, "Well, it seems to me that the only people who originated in the Americas were the Métis," and I got cheers from the other
I
Métis.
bet.
However, that's a way of looking at it, isn't it?
Sure, of
But
course.
again, that's of course another arbitrary way of
Yep.
looking at it. But I want to get back to the whole idea of the
Sure.
Enlightenment and how we incorporate that, because I started to tell you a story, then I got sidetracked a little bit. The Cree, of course, came from the Precambrian Shield, centered in northern Manitoba, actually. Why northern Manitoba? Because they were a weak, and it was land that not many other Indigenous people wanted. So they were in the swamp land in northern Manitoba, but that happened to be in a good location for the Hudson Bay Company, who set up on the bay, and the Cree became middlemen, and they got guns, and they started expanding westward, and eventually south and onto the northern plains, and so on. Now, when the Cree expanded into the northern plains, they did not keep the beliefs that they had when they were in the Precambrian Shield. They adopted things like the powwow and the thirst dance from Siouan cultures. Why did they do that? Because this is what people did on the plains. This was a new context, and they were said, well, we'll just imitate them. So their view was very pragmatic.
Right.
And that's a
Right.
difference between the spirituality of, I think, Indigenous people prior to contact. It was a pragmatic spirituality.
Right.
Yeah, you do it until it's in a different context, or until you find something that works better.
Mhm.
And that's what's different now. Hey, back in near the end of the 19th century, when the treaties were being signed, the chiefs and Indigenous people on the plains here, on the prairie provinces, wanted kids to go to school. I think the operative phrase there was to learn the cunning of the white man. Why? Because they recognized conditions had changed. The buffalo were gone. People were hungry. They needed to learn the skills to do well in a new environment.
Right.
It's very similar to the attitude of the Cree when they changed culturally, when they invaded and moved on to the plains. So very important. But now what's happened is something, the reverse has happened. What's happened is that it is now being considered that Enlightenment, that's a European thing. It's sort of like the stories about, the Bering Strait, that's just a theory. Well, the Enlightenment, that's just a European cultural practice. And other cultural practices are just as good. And what that means is indigenous kids are not getting the education that the chiefs in the late 19th century wanted them to get.
So what was adaptable, cultural adaptation, is now a bit of a 180. Instead of assisting in any way, I'm hearing terms like our culture was ripped from us. I'm hearing statements like that.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts in terms of, I don't want to in any way downplay the suffering that any human has endured by any other group. My question, again, might be seen as inflammatory, but did the residential schools in any way do any good for Aboriginal children? Or was it all bad?
Wow. Now that is an inflammatory question.
Okay.
Last year, an elder from the James Bay Cree, they're just south of Hudson Bay, in what is now Quebec and Ontario. An elder from the James Bay Cree was speaking at Concordia University, and she said that the residential schools for the James Bay Cree were different from the residential schools elsewhere. Attendance was voluntary, and people learned an education. So she had some good things to say. A group of students, younger students, they walked out. They complained. The university administration issued an apology about the racism that was being spread by this Indigenous elder. There's a lot of contradictions here. Now, I'm going to qualify this. Who is an elder depends on who is recognizing that person as an elder. Because of what she said, some people would not recognize her as an elder. But she was older, and she was wise, and she's experienced, and actually she was a retired university prof as well. So therefore, I would recognize her as an elder.
Mm-hmm.
There used to be a lot of Indigenous people who did have something good to say about the residential schools. This is not to say that they didn't have negatives, and I can talk to you about the negatives. In fact, I did a paper on what I called residential school syndrome at one time, and I can talk about that as well. But the people who used to have some good things to say about the residential schools that had good experiences, they've been silenced. Worse than that, I've had clients in northern Saskatchewan come to me, and they've wanted me to work with them over their repressed memories, because they went to residential schools, they didn't have any bad memories, and they were certain, since residential schools were evil places, bad things had to have happened to them, and therefore they must have repressed it because it was so evil, and they wanted to recover those memories. That's sad. That's really sad.
It is.
That people who have good memories would think that that means that there's psychologically something wrong with me because I don't have any bad memories.
Is that similar? And again, I don't want to take away people's suffering or what they actually experience, but Lloyd, I was an altar boy for 5 years, and I was never once propositioned by a priest. As far as I can remember, maybe I have suppressed memories, but you can help me with that maybe later. All the priests I knew were pretty fine guys. You know what I mean? They were well respected, and they genuinely wanted to help in the community and whatnot. And I would grow up later to no longer be a Catholic and whatnot. But my experience was pretty good, even though we know some nefarious activity, what was occurring at the time. In critical thinking, we try to divorce, or at least separate, the middle brain, the emotional limbic center, from the prefrontal cortex, so that we know when we get into these emotionally charged issues, we don't just let that part of our brain get the better of us. I'm able to separate my disdain for organized religion enough to be able to say, hey, I was an altar boy for 5 years, and it was a fine experience for me. I don't ever recall ever being abused. My closest friends weren't, at least as far as I know. Um, how do we get people to try to be more fair? Because in my writings, fairness is the cornerstone of critical thinking. You have to be fair. You have to try as best as you can to see both sides, even if it doesn't comply with your particular biases, your particular ideologies. And to me, that's always been the most difficult thing to get people to do, is to say, hang on, let's work through this. But as soon as I've tried to do that, I am seen as anathema, and I'm part of the problem for wanting fairness.
It's gotten worse, hasn't
It has. In wanting to be fair and to try to give anybody a voice, you're looked at now as part of the problem, which is facilitating that kind of hatred, bigotry, sexism, whatever it happens to be. How do we try to educate people, or to try to get the message out there that it's okay to talk about stuff that's unsavory against your personal political or philosophical or moral or religious ideologies? Because we need to. We can't just bury information. You can't just hide the data, as so many, bad scientists do. You have to look at all the data. If you want to be fair. If you don't want to be fair, just say that. And I'll take you at your word at whatever it is you're pimping out. But for the sake of, critical thinking, that's the most difficult thing to get people to say, yeah, you're right. There were some kids in the residential schools who profited from it. They actually went on and became successful, but you don't hear their story. And why? Is that a media thing? Is the media now so political that they won't show the other side? I thought that's what journalism was supposed to do, is to show us the bigger picture. What's happened? What's going on?
Well, definitely it's a media thing, but it's much more than a media thing. I
Mm-hmm.
had an experience reading a Globe and Mail article about a year ago, where three authors wrote a piece about Dr. Peter Bryce. And Dr. Peter Bryce was a medical officer for Indian Affairs back at the beginning of the 20th century, and he wrote several reports. One, which was quoted in this article, was dated 1907. And the authors of the article accused the Canadian government of genocide, and they were talking about actual killing people, not this wishy-washy cultural genocide thing, which is the term cultural genocide is very disrespectful of people who've actually suffered from genocide, like the Armenians, like the Jews, because that's an actual attempt to wipe people out of the gene pool.
Yeah, literally wipe them out.
You don't build schools to do that. You build concentration camps. However, the article accused the government of genocide and said that Peter Bryce was a visionary who wanted to shut the schools down, recommended shutting the residential schools down, and the government turned a deaf ear. That was their phrase. Turned a deaf ear on the report of Peter Bryce. I don't believe the authors actually read Peter Bryce. He recommended no such thing. He actually wanted more Indian residential schools to be built, not fewer. And the reason he wanted more, and he puts it in his papers, was that at the time of his study, he visited 35 schools in Western Canada, and he said only 52% of the treaty population were going to school. And he looked at the reasons why. One of the reasons why was because the schools were too far from the home reserves, and the parents didn't want to send them away that far. That was one of the reasons. Another reason was because after graduation, there weren't jobs that fit what the students were graduating with, and so attendance was reduced for that reason. A third reason was, although Indian agents had the power to tell parents, okay, you need to send your kids to school. Most Indian agents weren't being bothered. The schools are voluntary. What he did say, here's something he did talk about, which is, I think, very damning to the federal government, and that was that the death rate from those who started school through to graduation, 25% of the students died. No, 24%. I should not exaggerate. It was 24%. That's a damning figure. But one of the things that Bryce noted is that 3 of the schools of the 35 that he visited, although kids came to the school from their home communities with tuberculosis, and the reason for the death rate was tuberculosis almost totally at that time, he said 3 of the schools didn't have any deaths. Why? Because they practiced good nutrition, proper ventilation,
Hygiene.
and hygiene. Yes. So they had at that time, very progressive school principals that were enforcing these rules. And he said, so he wanted proper hygiene and proper medical checkups coupled with more schools. That's what he argued for. So I don't believe these authors actually read his report. They assumed they knew what it said because of a common narrative about residential schools, and so they simply wrote their story in the Globe and Mail to fit common narrative rather than dealing with the actual facts of what was said by this particular writer at that particular time. You said, is it the media? Definitely it's the media. I wrote the Globe and Mail pointing out these problems with the originating story and said, please give me an audience. And I invited them to publish my reply, and they did not.
Really?
Really?
Wow.
The Globe and Mail was not interested in printing the facts. They were interested in printing the narrative. Now, I have a theory as to why that has happened.
Mhm.
And by theory, I mean this seems to fit the facts as at least as I understand them. And that is back in the 1980s in particular, there was a movement in schools of journalism that said that in the ideal prior to that was taught in schools of journalism was that reporters should get at the facts and report both sides or 3 sides if there are 3 sides of issues, and in the 1980s that was replaced by the notion that the job of reporters is advocacy for the disadvantaged, and that was being taught in schools of journalism. So what that means, and you see this with papers like the Washington Post is a really good example. The New York Times has gone into this as well. Is the idea is to promote an advocacy of a position? Well, that's political propaganda. Now the
Pretty
people believe
much.
that they're well-meaning. They believe that they're doing good, but it's not different from what Putin's Russia is doing today with Russian media and the Russian media's coverage of the Ukraine war. It's putting together a position that and ignoring the rest.
Right.
I see that as part of a movement. We haven't given it a name yet today, and I call it wokeism for what I think are some solid reasons, because it's a movement that has evolved from many different sources. James Lindsay calls it neo-Marxism, and I disagree with him on that. Marxism had a hand in this movement. That's true. But Karl Marx would not recognize it. It's replaced the class analysis of Marxism with identity politics, which Marx was against. So that's a difference. Part of it had a Marxist root, but postmodernism, which was anti-Marxist. Postmodernists in the 1950s and 60s called Marxism a grand narrative, and by that they meant they were respectful. The postmodernists, but it's not postmodernism either. It takes from the postmodernists the idea that there is no such thing as objective reality, or if there is, we can't know it. And that's, oh, by the way, that was borrowed from Martin Heidegger in Being on Time, if you want to get specific. So therefore, postmodernism and modern wokeism has roots back in fascism. It borrowed from that too. But it's not true
Right.
postmodernism, because while it uses postmodernism techniques to deconstruct all other viewpoints, the woke viewpoint is held to be sacrosanct. It's beyond deconstruction. You're not allowed to do that.
Right. So has wokeism then become the grand narrative? Has it become what it's supposed to be against?
Yeah, and it's not just postmodernism and Marxism. I see pieces from the safetyist movement, safetyism. Where did that come from? Well, I can tell you, because I was part of that movement. It's a self-esteem movement of the 1980s. All over again. Well, not the whole self-esteem movement, a section of the self-esteem movement. And so on it goes. Martin Luther King would not recognize wokeism, but they borrowed from, in part, from King. But it's an evolving structure, and I believe that there were academics in the 90s and the early part of this millennium that carefully mapped out things. But I think it's not beyond that. When you take a look at the direction it's gone, it's out of control.
I agree. Just as you talked about the media moving in a more of an advocacy type of model. And by the way, I'm going to flesh out what you just said about postmodernists in case our viewers don't know everything we're talking about here. Postmodernism, I'm going to simplify it because I'm not a scholar of postmodernism, but it is a philosophical movement, a language movement and whatnot. You have Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, who are the superstars of this movement. Look, a lot of what's happened is the idea that there's no one genuine grand narrative, no overarching narrative to which others have to answer to. And it was reactionary towards science. If you want to know a little bit about the history of what was going on, you had the turn of the 20th century where science is just becoming incredible in terms of discovery, invention, technology, you name it. Look at Einstein's 2 papers in 1905. Look at, air travel. Look at everything just kind of marching along. And some of my colleagues in academia really believe that what was happening is that philosophy and English literature theory and a lot of these other humanities were falling out of favor as being heavyweights as academics. And so the scientists were just coming along and making philosophy a bit of a handmaiden. And to combat that, you had this kind of reactionary movement in academia where they tried to undercut science and say, well, there's no such thing as a grand narrative. There are just narratives, which is, I think, false. I think science does describe cause and effect relationships in the natural world better than any other fields that are offered. If there's something better than what the various sciences can say about these cause and effect relationships, I'm personally open. I'm welcoming of that. But you can't just critique, right? You can't just say, oh, science isn't all it's cracked up to be. Really? So if no narrative has any grander view of, in this case, cause and effect relationships, the next time you have chest pain, call your gardener. It's just one narrative, cardiology, pruning. These are just narratives. One isn't more superior to the other in any way, but clearly, implicitly, society does recognize that there is a greater grand narrative that is science, essentially.
Well, the sad thing, though, is that there are some people who do not accept what they call Western medicine and will use other means, which they view as alternatives, which is really unproven therapies, and people are dying as a result. Children are dying as a result because they're not getting the proper medical care when they need it, even though the care is there. We have the facilities.
Yeah, I know. It's we just the whole pandemic and what we've experienced in terms of anti-science, coming from both the left and the right in some cases.
It's coming from the right and the left, in a sense. We can talk about whether the wokeism is really left, because it seems to have bended. But we'll get into that in a moment. But the point that I'd like to make is this: that in terms of the Enlightenment technology and the Enlightenment view, that has traditionally been attacked by the religious right. It's still being attacked by fundamentalists, not just in Christianity, in Islam, and other religions as well. And our bastion in that has been the universities. The universities have been the ones that we've looked at, and by we, I'm talking about humanists in general. We've been looking to academia as our bulwark, as our defense, as to make our arguments more clear. We've lost that bulwark. The academia, to a large extent, has been taken over. I'll give you an example. The lead author for that article in the Globe and Mail that I talked about, she had a position with the funded by the federal government, working on curriculum for kids. And then after the Globe and Mail article, she got an assistant professorship at the University of Alberta. Now, that means that, to me, that a person's research record is not as important in academia, at least in many universities, as is their political alignment.
Yeah. There's a prof at McGill, and he applied 2 years in a row. He's a major researcher. I forget what field, biochemistry. And he was turned down both times because his students that he wanted to hire wasn't diverse enough. And he said, I'm hiring on merit. And they said, no, you got to mix up your student races and make them more diverse. He was turned down. And I think it might be cancer research. Like, we're not talking about, various forms of, say, esoteric poetry. We're talking about the hard sciences, where you need the very best people. When you go into the operating room for a major procedure, you don't care about political correctness. You don't care about how woke the staff are. You want the best. And we have lost our way in terms of hiring based on merit. And one of the things I really liked about symphony orchestras now is when they have tryouts, there's a screen and you don't know if it's male or female. You're just listening to them play, because that's when the shit hits the fan, when things are rough, you want your superstars front and center. You don't want to hire on irrelevant political agendas. You want the best. And when I go into an operating room, I want the best. And when I want people figuring out how the natural world functions, we want the best people. And so it's unfortunate, that we saw this. I saw it in the humanities, then I saw it in the social sciences, and now it's in the natural sciences. And so what has happened is this insidious, horrible effect has crept into departments, and it's basically ideologically castrated any male who wants to speak up about, hey, should we be doing it? As soon as anybody mentions anything, they are seen as the problem. And this is what happens to certain movements, is that people are trying to always outdo each other in these movements. Oh, you think that's woke? Watch this. You think that's woke? Watch this. And they keep topping each other.
I think there's a psychological dynamic operating here, because with wokeism, they've replaced the ruling class with the white race as the oppressor class, and males, of course, are viewed as being oppressive, patriarchal over women, and so white males are doubly oppressors under this way of thinking. Yet the majority of active people that was a moderator of two humanist discussion groups for Humanist Canada a couple of years ago. One of them was open; anybody could post, and the other one was closed. Only Humanist Canada board members at one point and employees could post. But the discussion was open.
Mm-hmm.
And what I noticed is the most woke people, the people who were most active in posting and most vicious in their comments, were white males.
Really?
And I got to thinking about that after some observation, because I moderated these groups for well, in one case, I was officially a moderator for about 4 years, but I was functionally a moderator much less than that. I took an active interest only the last year it was in operation. What I think is happening here is in wokeism, we have a belief system where people's worth, moral worth, is based on their status of oppression. And that puts white males in particular in a very vulnerable position. So if I was a white male, how could I protect myself? Well, I could protect myself by being the most vociferous, the most accusatory of anybody. And I even found, in terms of the closed discussion group, that these people who were most active on the woke side would go back after the discussion was over. They come back and edit their posts so that anybody reading their post would get the idea that, hey, these people were really really woke and really effective. This is after nobody else was paying attention. And I saw Peter Boghossian did an interview, and I saw it last week. This was a street epistemology interview. Street epistemology, for those who need to know, is a way of talking to people without forcing your ideas or putting your ideas forward. It's a questioning technique to find out what the basis of their thinking is and what it would take for them to move their position. So he was at Portland State University, and he invited people in a parking lot to talk about gender, trans women competing in female sports. And so he ended up in the end with three people standing on a line which showed that they're very strongly in favor of trans women competing, and two people not quite as firm on the other side. And Boghossian was in the business of asking these people to define their terms, because the terms we use is very important in a discussion, because sometimes we're speaking across each other. And he was also asking them what it would take for them to move, in this case, physically move in their position, because he had them standing on lines that said, I agree, I slightly agree, I strongly agree, I very strongly agree with a particular position. What would it take for them to move one slot? What kind of evidence that they would take? By the way, he asked the same questions to everybody, so he was being neutral to that extent. Mm-hmm. The three people that were strongly in favor of trans women competing in women's sports, one of them said that, well, if I got evidence that women, natal women were disadvantaged, that would cause me to move somewhat, but I'm not convinced that's true. And she was saying things like, well, there's a spectrum of ability right across the board, and so trans women are women, and therefore they should compete with other women, and that was her line. But the two others were hostile at even being asked questions. So not only did they attack the two people who disagreed with them and accused them of being transphobic, even though they hadn't said anything that was transphobic. They simply said they believed that other venues should be, and they were talking about possible other venues by which trans women could compete in sports. Not only did these two women attack those that disagreed, they attacked the moderator, Boghossian. Why did they attack him? Well, because he was not an ally.
Right. Interesting.
So that's where, as a society, we're degenerating down
Mm-hmm.
to. It's a Manichean reality of good versus evil, and if you disagree with the line, you are evil.
Right. Yeah. Yeah,
And
for
if you're
sure.
evil, then anything I say is appropriate. Anything I do is appropriate. There is no
Yeah,
fair.
exactly. Just as you had mentioned how the media has shifted from presenting different sides of a story to being more of an advocate for a type of political action. I watched that happen in real time at around 2004 when I was at a university, and the sociology criminology department was developing, and I was brought in to set up the curriculum for critical thinking and ethics and whatnot. And they were critical criminologists. So you hear critical a lot of times before subjects. And what does that mean? So I said critical, like I'm a critical thinker. I teach critical thinking. What's critical criminology? And it's like a Marxist feminist understanding of crime, essentially, that if we didn't live in capitalist systems and we had more equality amongst the sexes, the crime would come down a great deal. And when I said, "What about biological factors? Do you consider that, to any degree?" And I got the hand literally like waved in my face saying, "I don't do that evolution thing." And that's when I saw the change occur in real time then in my world. And I'll never forget the professor said, "We're not just professors, we're social justice warriors." And that was in 2004, the first time I ever heard that term. And I thought, "What do you mean?" She said, "We're training students to go out and make change." So it was already in their mind to take a kind of a woke ideology. And so if you're wondering, how is it that all of this stuff has come to be? It's from generations of being taught in a particular way through a particular ideology. And the interesting thing about it is that they tend to define the world in terms of power struggles. You're either oppressed or you're the oppressor. And there's no real gray. It's either one or the other. And being a white male, you're going to be largely associated as an oppressor. But the ironic thing, Lloyd, is that in my academic career, I've been nothing but oppressed by these people in power who are telling me I'm the problem. And so I don't have tenure because I'm an oppressor. Life is not without.
Well, one thing I've noticed is people who have adopted this woke ideology really don't have a sense of humor and so are not likely to pick up on irony. There's just to illustrate that, this last Sunday, a reporter at the Washington Post uh, found out that he had come down with COVID. And so he reported, he wrote on his social media uh, that he was upset with COVID because they should not have this should not have happened on Father's Day. He was making a little joke about himself and his situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
a fellow reporter at the Washington Post called him to task, said the only way that you can joke is because you have privilege, knowing that because of your white privilege, you're likely going to survive, and but you should have some empathy for people who are less privileged.
Mm-hmm.
No sense of humor at all.
No.
Now, you and I can recognize that when we're faced with something like COVID or any disease, one healthy reaction is to find some humor in it.
Mm-hmm.
And just like the way this first reporter uh, said, but that would be beyond the ability of the woke in this
I know.
example to recognize.
Wasn't there somebody had mentioned, I don't know if it was Bill Maher, somebody mentioned recently, a reporter at the Washington Post retweeted a joke. When a woman tells you she's bi, does she mean sexual or polar? And that was hilarious. It's just a play on words, right? No, it did not go over well.
And of course, when hearing that joke, you know that the person speaking is not being serious.
No,
I hope you realize that.
Not.
But
of course not.
But I saw the reaction. The woke thought this person is being perfectly serious, and they attacked it on that basis.
Oh my goodness! How did we get so thin-skinned? Why can't we take a joke anymore? What? Why are comics? Like, put it this way: in 1970, George Carlin said, "I'm changing my style. I'm going from a straight-laced, short-haired, tie and suit kind of guy to I'm growing my hair. I'm going to say what I think. I'm going to say what I want, and I got to start playing more on more university campuses. Man, that's where they get me. They'll get this humor, right? If he were alive today, he wouldn't go near a university." So from 1970 till now, look at how things have changed. Why are our children and children's children so sensitive to humor? Why can't they take a joke, I guess, is what I'm asking. What happened?
Yeah, those are good questions, and I don't know that I have the answers. Now, I've written about wokeism back in 2017. I published an article on mind viruses, uh, and I look at cults, quite frankly. I examined them, and I examined the phenomena of Islamic terrorism for commonalities, and I said that okay, I call it revisiting Dawkins' idea that there was a mind virus, and I set out some of the parameters by which we could diagnose a mind virus. Then last year, I published an article in which I looked at wokeism as a mind virus, and I concluded that wokeism satisfied the 4 criteria. And I also showed, using my method of mapping the self, that how a mind virus such as wokeism could attach onto a person's self, and when it attaches, then it feels as though it's essential to one's being. And I think that's what's happened with wokeism. So the woke who are fully affected, wokeism is essential to who they are. They can't if it's taken away from them, then they feel that something has been ripped. They've been ripped apart in some sense. And so that's one of the reasons they fight so vociferously. The other thing that wokeism does is it creates woke very effectively, and we've seen how it's done. They, as far as the woke is concerned, they promote their ideology, and there is no debate.
Right.
They will silence people who disagree. Waterloo in your province has been in the news lately, hasn't it? The school board. First, they silenced a teacher who actually was quoting 2 books that were for elementary schools that was teaching transgenderism.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a fine dividing line here between teaching about sexuality. And I'm not sure primary school children are appropriate to be teaching about sexuality, but there's certainly a line that you cross when you're talking about the specifics of sexuality, and then it comes across like grooming. You're grooming these
things. It does. Or indoctrination.
Yeah. So anyway, this teacher got 4 minutes of school board time before the school board chair shut her down, cut off her mic, and she was removed from the meeting. One of the fellow school board trustees defended the teacher. And I learned last week that he's now been removed from the school board. They didn't give any reason, but he's been suspended until September. He's not allowed, he will not receive notification of meetings, and he will not be allowed to attend meetings. And they didn't say why, but we suspect it was because he defended this teacher.
I think she has since quit her position and is now suing the board and the council member who shut her down. She now has an ongoing lawsuit because she feels as though her rights have been violated. all she was saying was, look, have you read this material? Do you think this is appropriate for a grade 2 student to hear? I mean, it's talking about hormone blocks and, all this, kind of fairly technical stuff. It's like, do they even fathom this? And nobody is questioning, gender dysphoria, those who are facing these very difficult decisions in life and what. And that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is, what is a person's right for freedom of speech if they happen to differ from somebody else? This is why critical thinking is so important, because it says, oh, you see things differently. Instead of me hating you because you don't agree with what I happen to agree with, what is it that you're saying, and how is it that we can best understand you? And how can we best present your alternative view in its best possible light, what we call steel manning a person's argument, rather than deliberately misinterpreting it and then attacking the misinterpretation like a straw man. We owe it to the other person. This is why fairness is the cornerstone of critical thinking. Let me hear what it is you're trying to say, and let me see if I can say it back to you in its best possible light. That is how we should be having dialogue. Right? This is how we should be discussing important issues, rather than coming in with our confirmation biases, blocking out everyone else, and only listening to those who happen to agree with us. What a boring world that would be if there was, no conflict, no, confrontation, no, challenges to differing views, or just allowing people the freedom to be able to speak their mind without the type of reprisal we're seeing in terms of ideological bullying, because let's call it what it is, right? That's what it is. It's a form of bullying. I'm sorry. You gotta call people out for what you see. And when they violate the very structure of common decency and civility in having discourse, we do get to have these conversations, these very important conversations about what it means to return back to a level of civil discourse where we can not just hear the other person, but now we can reformulate it in our heads, say it back to them so that they know we've got it. And then, so I might disagree with you. Do I have your position correct? Okay, excellent. I agree with some of it, but I disagree with it, here, 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 and here. Oh, then the other person gets to do the same thing to you. Let me see if I've got your position right. And then they say it back to the individual. Okay, yeah, that's pretty much got it. Okay, I agree with this, this, and this, but I disagree here, here, and here. You see how this speeds up the process, how it eliminates wasted time, money, and energy? Because critical thinking gets people to be clear right up front so that they save the most important stuff for later on in the dialogue. And instead, we're getting people talking past each other, which wastes so much time. And then people get offended and they immediately want to go either to the media or to a lawyer or somewhere else, right? And if we could just learn better how to have these conversations, and this brings me to my next topic, Lloyd. I've been trying, as you know, for years to try to get critical thinking taught in schools, in high schools. And here in Ontario, I had some luck with the Liberal government, and then the PCs won, and I haven't been able to get any headway. And of course, COVID interrupted as well. But personally, I think we have to make a push for teaching, getting critical thinking into the curriculum of, let's just start with high school. And then we'll figure out how we can do it from K to 8. But how important do you think it is that we develop a program or get a curriculum to acknowledge critical thinking for students to be able to take from grade 9 to grade 12? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's crucial. I think I take a look at my own education, and I've been associated with schools, particularly in northern Saskatchewan, for a very long time, well over a quarter of a century. I've seen changes, and I think the schools have actually gone backwards with respect to teaching some of these critical thinking skills. And what you're talking about is a the kind of dialogue that helps all of us to overcome error. So it, the two of us together are smarter than either of us individually, Chris. Because we are combining our experience and combining our thoughts, and maybe we don't disagree, maybe we don't agree on some point, but there still are things that you can gain from me and I from you, even on those points where we disagree, and that will in the end help us to become stronger, and in terms of our thinking and our thought processes. Now, here's the key, because I respect your work on critical thinking and education, because I know you've done a lot of it, and I would like to hear more about your successes, because from where I'm seeing, that's where the battle is at. Because there isn't this ideology that is degrading the idea of critical thinking. That critical thinking is a Western oppression way of thinking.
Right.
I had a professor at the University of Calgary in my doctoral program who wrote an article declaring that science was a white male way of knowing. Getting back to how we started this conversation, well, that's the opposite of critical thinking, isn't it? And the battle will be joined, and I'm not sure how we're doing right now. I'd like to think that through your work and the work of others, we're making progress. But I know that there's people. Wokeism is a kind of a religion that involves total belief, and there are people that are beyond reach. They are beyond reach.
I know.
They're starting young. They're starting at the primary level. They're starting at the kindergarten level. And those of us who value the Enlightenment, uh, we've got to do the same, and we've got to reach the parents.
I agree. I've been thinking, once we can get a program into high schools and people can start to see the success, it'll be much more easy to move it to a K-8 level. And some have said, well, how do you teach a kindergartner critical thinking? And it's like with basics, the most basic way, possible. It doesn't necessarily mean we're teaching it at an abstract level. There are very basic principles to the way in which we can think more critically. Lloyd, I've thought about rebranding. Should we call it something other than critical thinking? Is the name itself somewhat intimidating to people? Do we call it clear thinking? Do we call it better thinking, responsible thinking? Do we have to rebrand it so that it has less negative connotations, so that people, I was at a primary school playing basketball years ago, and I'd still be playing if it weren't for COVID. And every year we'd come into this gymnasium, you could see that they put up a sign on the wall. Every time we were there, there'd be a different sign: tolerance, peace, compassion, like all of these great virtues. But critical wasn't one of them. And that's a virtue, right? To critically think means you're being responsible. The term is epistemically responsible. It just means to be responsible for how you acquired your information. That's it. And I think we're seeing less and less epistemic responsibility on a number of levels throughout society.
Yeah, I think a connotation that comes with the idea of critical thinking is to be against, to be negative.
Yes.
And that's not what critical thinking is. But we know that, you know that, I know that, but the public does not necessarily know that. Then there's another connotation too, and that is there's such a thing called critical race theory.
Yes.
And critical race theory does not practice critical thinking at all. But that plays into the connotation. Okay, critical race theory means they're against something, and they will tell you they're against racism. By the way, it's not a theory either, as you know, because it's not falsifiable. So there's no way of proving it wrong. It's a dogma. Yeah. Could we replace the term critical thinking with just thinking skills, or is that too easy?
Perhaps. Whatever it takes to convince educators that this is important, that and it's really tricky. When I had the pilot project for a year and I was going into high schools to work with 3 different schools, there were 3 types of teachers I found. Those that were close to retirement who said, can't teach an old dog new tricks. Thanks for doing this, but I'm out of here in a year or 2. Good luck with this. And then there were those who said, I already teach critical thinking. It's a part of my curriculum. I instill it in every student or whatnot. And then you find out that what they're teaching is actually more, say, creative thinking than critical thinking. Oh, okay. All right. To which I say, that's great that you're doing that, but wouldn't you want every teacher to have access to the same, like, wouldn't you want everybody to be able to teach these skills and that kind of thing? And then the largest group by far were the younger teachers who embraced it and said, this is exactly what we need in the curriculum. And so the pilot project got big thumbs up. Everybody from teachers to vice principals to superintendents, directors, to the Minister of Education loved the idea. And then an election came along. And the Liberals were out. And the project was dropped. And it's been that way ever since. So now I have to see what Mr. Ford's cabinet shuffle is going to be like in the next little while. See if he changes his education minister from Stephen Lecce to somebody else. And if not, just keep trying to get something working. But it's unbelievably frustrating to know how many people think this is important, but you just can't make it happen because there's just so much red tape everywhere within the system. It's just so incredibly frustrating. So if you have any advice, I would certainly welcome that.
Chris, if I had a magic wand, I'd use it to help you because it's a necessary project. But in terms of Ontario politics, really, I don't have any advice. You could change the name a little bit to make it more sellable, I suppose. But really, in the end, you see, there's 2 views of society, aren't there? There's society as. By the way, I don't view the woke as being progressive, and this is one of the reasons. True progressives view society as being capable of making incremental gains and improving the lot of everybody. That's one view of society. But there's another view of society that has us pictured as a closed system. And if one group gets more, then another group has to get less. And that view of society involves a set of rote learnings.
Right.
It's not critical thinking. It's not thinking. You memorize what the truth is. And that's what we're finding.
Interesting.
Now, in memorizing what the truth is, what the woke offer then is they offer people a purpose, a higher purpose that they can feel good about themselves. I read about a Formula One racing car driver who, from the hotel to the racetrack, bicycles to the in order to save on energy. But think about that. Those machines consume a huge amount of gas, and on top of that, he flies from from continent to continent to get to his races. Yet he feels he's doing some good. So that what is that? That is virtue signaling.
Oh yeah.
That's virtue signaling. But wokeism involves a lot of that. I feel good about myself because, oh, hey, I really called down the bad guys today. This person was against tearing down a John A. This is an actual example that came from the Humanist Discussion Group. This person was opposed to tearing down John A. Macdonald statues, and so therefore I called him out. I said he favors raping and torturing little children.
Gee.
That's an actual example of something that this is a wokeism, and they feel virtuous doing it. Now, in terms of the virtue signaling, that's part of it. It also has all other kinds of psychological benefits. It gives me an excuse. Hey, I'm not a famous brain surgeon, and I always wanted to be one. Obviously, it was because of my race.
Yes. Right.
Uh, Throw in any example you want. I have a reason, unless I'm a white male, I have a reason for my own failure where I don't have to look at myself.
Hmm.
And motivation doesn't count because and that's where wokeism through identity politics dissolves into a set of quotas, because motivation and hard work and ability, these are not important. What's important is that you're in the correct assigned group to get the job or get the position to fill that quota. There's a lot of benefits to wokeism for people who are woke, but there's also a lot of negatives too. But they don't understand. They don't know what they don't know, and so they don't understand what they're losing
Yeah.
on the other
Yeah.
side.
All right, sir. Last thing we're going to talk about here very briefly. How do we figure out what's fair in terms of reparations for people who have been oppressed?
I have trouble with that term, reparations. To me, reparations is giving back something that was taken from you. And so, if the Nazis go into another country and steal a lot of art, the reparations involve giving back that art. I can understand that. But that's not how the term reparations is being used today. And this gets back to the identity politics. Pluckrose and Lindsay use the term grievance studies. I have a grievance. My ancestors lived in a veritable Garden of Eden that was stolen. The alcoholism, the theft, the crime, that's all a result of colonialism. I need to get back to the garden, and it's your job to get me back there. I don't think that's a workable formula, but that's the feeling. This is at an emotional level that a lot of people who are demanding reparations, uh, this is what they feel to be true. And of course, because there's no objective reality, it's the subjective feeling that is important. So it's my narrative that is important, not everybody coming together and figuring out what is actually true.
Hmm. How will we ever know when the reparations have been are sufficient, that we're good? Are we, like, as they say, are we good now? Has everybody been taken care of? Is that even a possibility?
Well, so, here I'm going to draw on my background as a psychologist a little bit. I don't think that reparations under that formula are ever going to be fulfilled. Because why? Because we as human beings, we have foibles. Life isn't perfect. There's always problems, and if I can blame my problems on another group, then whenever I don't meet a goal or I face a disappointment, uh, give you an example here. This is a few years ago in La Ronge, northern Saskatchewan. We had a murder. A woman who was a band member was murdered by her common law husband, who was from another band, a different band, and he escaped with their daughter onto an island in Lac La Ronge, and eventually was apprehended by the police. And the man's sister went before the media and said to the media, "My brother is the real victim here. He's the real victim because he went to residential school. And anything he did was the responsibility of the colonizer because they made him what he was." Under that system, there is no reparation. Uh, it's never ending. Uh, I noticed a couple of months ago. I noticed some figures. I took the figures for the budget for Indian Affairs, and I added to it the budget this is for 2021, of medical services branch, well, it used to be called medical services branch, the indigenous portion of national health and welfare. And then I divided it by the total number of people with treaty numbers. And it came to $34,000 per capita. This is just in 1 year. Now, since the majority of benefits go to on reserve populations, they get more than indigenous people who are off reserve. The per capita spending yearly on reserve must be at least $50,000. That's a very conservative estimate. So a family of five, the budget is $250,000 per year per family of five. Now, that is independent of other sources of income that may be there too. So, having said that, of course, the ordinary reserve band member is not receiving most of that.
Right.
It isn't there. But there needs to be a royal commission of Canada's famous for royal commissions. Why not have one on where all the money is going? Medicine says it's going to the Aboriginal industry. Well, let's document that. Let's find out.
Lloyd, one thing I got to ask you, it disturbs people like me and my colleagues and my friends when we hear of reservations that don't have safe drinking water. And why? What is going on? Is that us? Is that white guys? Did we screw this up? Is it mismanagement of infrastructure funding on the reservation? Like I have no idea because I don't frequent reservation. You know what I mean? I can't be there to see what's actually going on. But why is water such a major issue on so many reservations? Do you know, like, if you do, that it could help in some way? I'd appreciate that.
Well, I think safe drinking water is a basic necessity.
Oh, without question.
But there are many ways of meeting that necessity. For a very small community, many on-reserve populations are around 250, 300 people. That's a small population. And given economies of scale, I'll tell you who has safe drinking water in Canada. It's the cities, because they got the population that warrants the expenditure. You can't expect the same expenditure on a community of 200 or 300 people. So it depends on the situation, the context. There are various ways of providing safe drinking water, and one way is to truck it in, because that is what is done. I took a look at the water advisories in Saskatchewan, and Saskatchewan has some of the best water on the planet in northern Saskatchewan, but southern Saskatchewan not so much. And there were this was 2 years ago, and there were about 80 communities at the time I looked that had a water advisory out. Most of these were very small communities. Many were isolated communities, and most of them were non-native communities. So in Saskatchewan, and I imagine this is true for the rest of Canada, a lot depends on where you happen to be. And drinking water on reserve, important priority. Let's spend the money on it. Get it done. Find ways of doing it that are also economic. But I don't see it as a racist thing. I see it as a matter of location, because there's an awful lot of non-native communities that also have poor drinking water.
Oh, okay. Interesting. All right, good. I think we could spend all night talking about various topics, Lloyd. I think we might have to wrap things up there. Is there anything else you'd like to mention or talk about, or do you have some projects coming up? Anything you want to tell us?
Well, Chris, this has been a slice. I just looked at my clock, and it's been almost 2 hours, and I was expecting we'd only spend 1 hour. But I've enjoyed it. With the new Enlightenment project, we're looking at new ways of combating some of the problems that we've identified in this discussion. And by the way, I'm hoping that you will. I'm on your podcast. I'm on your series right now. I'm hoping that in the future you will return the favor and
sure.
You'll do a new Enlightenment project under a slightly different format. But the work is ongoing, and part of the ongoing work is to do exactly the kind of thing that we've been doing today and discussing the issues. And hopefully people will take a look at those issues. One of the things that I'd like to do in the future is go into more detail on how the racial, the gender ideology, and other disadvantaged groups like, hey, there's fat studies. When I first heard the line about fat studies, I thought it meant helping people to get healthier who are obese.
Right.
That's not what I mean.
No.
All of that fits together, and I'd like to explore that in
Okay.
more detail.
Well, we can leave that for the time I'm on your podcast. We can discuss that a little more.
Okay. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for having me, Chris.
My pleasure. Thanks for being on.